Whoa. I'm David Dahl, the Merced County Farm Advisor. A lot of you guys know me. I've been down at these meetings since my rookie day. So I think since 2008. So these meetings are really nice. It's nice to see you guys out in the field, and again, it's nice to see you trying to figure out how to make these be more efficient with your farming operations in many different ways. So they have me kind of taking the place of Walt Bentley a little bit today, and we're going to focus a little bit on insects, nitrogen, crop development, and water. So I got a lot of topics to kind of cover very quickly. But some of you know me, you're like, yeah, right, you quit, never. So we'll start off, PTB, peach twig borer. Our biofix in this area was around March 15th, which means if we're worried about PTB, which is also can be a little bit of an issue when we manage navel orangeworm, we want to target our insecticide application around 300 to 400 degree days past the biofix. Last time I checked, we're approaching 290. Which was this morning in the Fresno area, which means our biofix is probably the earliest timing on that of 300 will be in about a week, 3 to 4 days if it stays like this, and it'll continue on for about another probably 2 weeks, 10 days. If it stays cool, if it gets hot, it'll go much more rapid. So if you're worried about PTB in your orchard, so if it's a third or fourth leaf orchard and you haven't sprayed, we're coming up on that timing for that spring timing. The thing about spring timings is we want to probably shy away from the use of pyrethroids because they tend to flare mites. So we tend to look more towards growth regulators and calcium disruptors. So Intrepid, Altacore, Belt, Delegate in some cases as well, but Delegate can flare mites if you're dealing with six-spotted thrips. We'll get to that in a minute. Okay, and the other biofix of importance is navel orangeworm. Our egg traps lit up around here on the 27th of March. And ideally with navel orangeworm, we try to spray 100 degree days later. And unfortunately, we're already over that today. We're over 100 degree days. We hit 100 around the 8th of April, which is I think just yesterday, right? Mine's going blank. So why that's important is in many cases, we'll have overlap between the PTB spray and the navel orangeworm spray. So by making an application for PTB, we get residual control on the navel orangeworm. But since we had this warmer winter, warmer spring, navel orangeworm became active much earlier, and so they're out and about and they're flying. Now, we found in a lot of the plots that we have in Merced, in which we're evaluating egg traps to male flight moths, which we're still figuring that one out, so don't ask. We're getting a lot higher egg count and even male moth activity in less sanitized orchards. Makes sense. We've always said this from the very beginning. Winter sanitation is the best step towards reducing navel orangeworm populations, getting those nuts out of the tree. Now, ideally, we try to target, the industry standard is 2 per tree, and you guys are thinking, why is he flogging sanitation now, but I'll get to it in a minute. But in the Fresno area, we need to probably target more, 1 per tree on average. And now with this ranch here, and this is Gina, our host's ranch. She always does a very nice job. This is the Butte Padre orchard. It's a hard shell orchard, and many of you are thinking, I don't even need to worry about sanitizing these, they're hard shells. And that may be true unless you have a nonpareil block that's to the south or to the east or to the west. What we found with Padre is that even though we don't get a lot of nut infestation, the navel orangeworm tends to overwinter in that hole, and it does a really nice job. So we tend to have a lot of survival even in these Butte Padre blocks. So if you're next to a Butte Padre block that's a little bit dirty, or if it's your block that's a little bit dirty and you have a nonpareil or an Independence or some other soft shell block surrounding it, keep in mind that you're going to have migrating populations out of that block when you go into these timings. Things to keep in mind with navel orangeworm, we tend to focus on it a lot. Why I'm bringing this up is I think as I look at the trends in pesticide usage over the past 3 to 4 years, with the drought, we've been getting increased pressure with navel orangeworm. So with the increased pressure, we've been wanting to spray more, as well as with the increase in price. Be thoughtful and be judicious with that application. It's starting to make some waves upstairs, if you know what I mean, in regards to pyrethroid usage and as well as organophosphates. So So what can we do outside of chemical applications? We all know the hull split timing is a very effective timing. But one thing we can do is try to make sure that we can harvest these trees as early as possible. Not early enough that we shake and damage the tree, but get those nuts out of the tree on a timely process. Why is the earlier we can shift that harvest timing, less exposure to navel orangeworm as the population gets higher in the season. So early harvest and good winter sanitation can do a really good job. And if you're in a little bit of a cooler area, like in northern Merced County, that's what many of those guys actually do for their navel orangeworm plan. Sanitation and early harvest, and they don't even make a spray. So it's not saying that's the case in every orchard, but it's something to keep in mind that those two practices are very critical in managing navel orangeworm in our orchards. Okay, so I'm going to move to other insects real quick. San Jose scale, going back to the question on lower limb dieback, I'm seeing more and more of it. I got some samples I pulled out of Gina's orchard. If you look at these, you'll see a little bit of a speck, and it's like a kind of a waxy cap. That's San Jose scale. It's very easy to pick up this time of year when you look at last year's green wood. So check your orchard. The sad thing is we missed the spring timing. The crawlers are already wet, and you actually can see the new scale starting to lay down. So what this means is we can't really do much right now for the season. But what we can do is make sure when we see it in our orchard that we plan for an application in the wintertime. We know that about 6 gallons of oil will do a nice job of a dormant application and controlling it. Many of you guys are saying, well, Dave, that makes great sense, but it hasn't rained. I'm going to burn my trees. My pushback would be, I don't know if I've ever even seen oil burn on almond trees, except for when there was a mechanical breakdown. But if you're not comfortable making that 6 gallons of oil, or even looking at the price of it, consider putting in a growth regulator to control scale and that delayed dormant timing. And you can knock down that oil and put in a growth regulator and clean up these scale problems that are starting to emerge in a lot of orchards. We're seeing walnut scale in Monterey as well. It's becoming very common, and I actually was in an orchard where the guy says, I have a lower limb dieback of my Monterey. And I said, have you even looked at your wood? He said, why? I said, this thing is crawling with scale. It was so thick you could scrape it off. It looked like the lichen, but it was all scale. So Monterey scale it's much larger. It's kind of white and kind of a irregular boundary or irregular border. So keep an eye on it. And if you have in your orchards, plan for the respective dormant treatment. We don't have it listed as a pest within almond, but if you look on the IPM website under walnut and look at walnut scale, you'll get some pictures. And we're really only finding it on Monterey. The flip end is we also have European fruit lecanium scale, which I'm also seeing, and that's that big soft scale that has like a brown shell and you kind of can pinch it. I'm seeing more of that. It tends to kind of flare up in the spring and it tends to die down, but you get sticky leaves from it. So it tends to feed on the leaves, makes everything real sticky, so when you try to harvest, everything's gummed together. Keep an eye on that. And I think a lot of this has to do with probably we're reducing the amount of parasitoids that are overwintering in these orchards, why these scales are picking up. But I will say that we have to probably keep in mind that about every 3 to 5 years, these problems just gradually build, and you have to kind of clean them up, and then they ride for 3 to 5 years, and then clean them up. We moved away from these dormant sprays, but we're finding out that in general we have to keep an eye and just know when to pull the trigger. Okay, mites, and this kind of rolls into scale. I've been in a lot of orchards where people want to spray miticides, and I said, you don't need to. And they said, what do you mean? There's predators on the leaves, there's mites on the leaves. Use that presence-absence sampling provided through the UCIPM website to help you determine when. If you have predators in your orchard and you go through and spray for mites, you're going to kill off all the food. And the predators aren't going to hang around, they'll leave. And you might even kill them as well. So why I'm bringing that up is I was in 3 orchards and they said, well, we need to spray, and this is 2 weeks ago. I said, there's no way you need to spray for mites. It's been cool, there's nothing on your leaves. We look at it, and there are mites, but there are 6 spotted thrips everywhere in that orchard feeding on them. So he let it ride, and 3 weeks later, The problem is actually going down, it's not increasing. So use that presence-absence sampling to make that decision. Don't just put it into the tank because it's, quote, time or you're making a ride through the field. And why that's important is because those predators, as they knock down that population, help postpone the first miticide application, which then kills off the predators, which then causes a flare-up later in the season. So the later you can delay that first miticide application, the better. Leaf-footed plant bug. A lot of reports, a lot of media hype. I haven't seen much. I know there's been scattered reports, but every time I look in my notes of when I start getting calls on leaf-footed plant bug, it's usually around the end of April, beginning of May, which means the damage happened about 2 weeks before. So, you know, so if you think it's right around early April to mid-April. The only difference to this year and probably in previous years is I think this is probably one of the thickest hulls I've seen on a lot of nuts in many orchards. And we also have some of the fastest crop development that I've probably seen ever. And I mean, granted, I'm a rookie at this compared to some of you guys, but I've been hearing this comment from a lot of farmers as well. So once that shell hardens, and with that thick hull, the damage might be minimized. So be a little bit judicious in putting out that pyrethroid or that those other materials. Oh, my mind just went blank. That was a Bayer product, but anyways. Putting out those broad spectrums to knock back that bug. It's a hard one to kill, I understand, and it causes a lot of damage, but just make sure you need to pull the trigger before you pull the trigger. And usually by the time you see damage, it's too late. So you need to be out now, listening for them, banging on some trays to try to capture them, looking for the little boxcar eggs laid on the side of nuts. Looks like a little train going around the nuts to see if they're there. Okay, so crop development, that rolls right into nitrogen. We are ahead of schedule. I think we're as much as a month ahead of schedule. This is a beaut. We're already getting kernel fill. The embryo is starting to develop in the tip of the almond. In nonpareil, it's about a week ahead of this. So we're actually getting the bottom part of the almond starting to fill. We're in the first week of April. Usually, this starts about a week from, or about 2 to 3 weeks from now, and sometimes a month from now. We always normally anticipate kernel fill by the end of May. I think this year we're looking at the end of kernel fill probably around the end of April, first week of May. Maybe if it cools down, they'll slow down a little bit. But I would plan for this accordingly when you're thinking about your nitrogen budgets. Why is that important? The party line has started to become that we want to try to get about 80% of our nitrogen budget out before the end of kernel fill. Let that tree ride out to pull some of the vigor so you get a nice even shake and a reduction of hull rot. And then you come back into the post-harvest period and you put on another 20 to 25%. You're thinking it adds up to 105, at least if you were paying attention. You guys understand. So 85 pounds of nitrogen to apply for every 1,000 pounds of crop you think are in the tree. We want to make that over probably at least 3 spring feedings, so 3 fertigation events in the spring. I think if you can split it up a little bit more, it helps. Just think, would you rather have 4 or 5 meals instead of 3 meals? But making sure we have that completed this year by probably the beginning of May, but track your own crop. All you have to do is take a knife and cut it open. I know this is costing you a penny to do this year, but go to your neighbor's field. They won't know. You know, and see how that's filling up before when you're making those decisions. So one thing that's important when we start talking about hull rot, and I'm going to pull this back from Dorit, is a lot of times when we're dealing with hull rot issues, we're dealing with uneven ripening and not being able to get in there in the shade. And a lot of this comes back to vigor. And I think we like to really push these trees hard in the spring, especially after bloom. But as you're probably all saying, well, this is again too late. Thanks again, Captain Obvious. But trying to back off on those heavy applications of nitrogen in the early part of the spring and match that nitrogen application with the uptake. So trying to spoon feed in the beginning and then start hitting it a little harder once it warms up. So right now is a good time to put out those heavy shots, you know, of 25, 30, 40, 50 gallons or 50 pounds per acre, not back in the first week of March. So keep that in mind as you go through and look at your own plan. Hull-less thicker, I think we all know what that means. Won't say that for the media. Sorry, Todd. The other thing, going back to fertigation, and this goes back to salinity, I know we have a lot of water run products, and we want to inject them every single time. We want to put in our potassium thiosulfate or nitrogen, I don't know what else, or complex whatever, and we just want to use that injection system every time. It doesn't hurt to run a little bit of water on its own every once in a while to help manage salinity. And to bring that around, I know a lot of us are relying on wells, get that water analyzed to know how much salt's in it, as well as how much nitrate, nitrogen, and reduce that from your budget. We can assume that's at least as efficient as the nitrogen we're applying through fertilizer. Why I'm bringing it up is I was in an orchard of second leaf trees. He went out and he put out a very small application of about 5 pounds of nitrogen, but his trees are showing uptake burn. We looked at his nitrate nitrogen in his water. It was around 25 ppm nitrate nitrogen. So just that added boost with the high temperature was creating issues of uptake because it was already in the water. And now water. I know that's the word. That's the theme of the year. I should hand these around. I don't know why I'm holding these. You want to? Elias, can you take one around? Let's take one here. With water, I brought some handouts. We're a university, we love handouts. This is the simplified version. They're on the table. And this is the more complete version. So the one that has the picture of the almond tree on it, I brought fewer of these because I know many of you probably won't read all 10 pages of it. 10 pages of it. But if you need some bathroom material, there you go. Runs through all the different stages of the crop. When you cut the water, what it does to the tree. This one's a much more simplified version. So the strategies of dealing with water reduction, I know we can get very complicated and walk you through some very complicated schemes that might give you a little bit better return, but the most consistent and the easiest to schedule is what we call proportional deficit irrigation. You look at the amount of water you have, it's 50% of what you normally have. You apply 50% of the amount of water across the whole season. The idea is you don't get the tree too excited and too vigorous in the spring, then cut the water off, which gives you a shriveled kernel when you come in the harvest. You stress the tree evenly so it thins the crop when it needs to, and it's able to fill and give you a marketable crop with what it does keep on the tree. Last year we had an orchard that the well went out. He was irrigating it full, but the well went out in May compared to an orchard in which he irrigated the same amount of water evenly across the season. They yielded very similarly. The surprising thing is marketability was much higher in the one where he irrigated proportionally across the season. So don't dump everything on now thinking it's going to get you the crop. Spread it out and make sure you save some water for post-harvest. That's why it's important to kind of guess how much water you're going to need and give yourself a percentage of what you have available. If you undershoot, being a little bit too conservative, that's okay. Apply it in the post-harvest. The trees will utilize it for development in the coming year. Non-prowl was off this year, and I think this has to do a little bit with late fall stress. So when we get these hotter than normal falls, it becomes important to make sure we have some resources available to keep these trees fed and watered. If you're fortunate enough that you're looking at maybe just a 15 or 10 to 15% reduction of water coming into June, well, this year it's going to be earlier. So once you get that kernel completely filled, you'll start reducing that water back in order to make that savings. If you're on a heavier soil such as this, there's a good chance you may be able to cut that first irrigation by 50% and then slowly add water back in to get to a stress level that you want. If you're doing this and you come into your orchard at the end of the week before you irrigate or before the next irrigation cycle and all the trees are like this, you cut too much water. You went too far. That's not regulated deficit irrigation. That's just drying the tree out and making it very upset. So the idea is if you're not using a pressure chamber, you want to see it look a little sad, but you don't see it wilted over. So that's the idea. If you get too far, add a little bit more water back in. And the reason why I bring that up is because everybody says, oh, I'm practicing regulated deficit irrigation, and all they do is they cut every irrigation after kernel fill by 50%, and the trees drop all their leaves, they look like crap, and then they say, well, the university has their head somewhere and they don't know what they're talking about. The former may be correct, but I will say that they need to make sure that they're not over-irrigating, or they're not under-irrigating these trees during that time, because it will pull moisture out of the kernel. So use a little bit of common sense, but the idea is to pull some of that deep moisture up to even up the hull split and hopefully get a little bit even of a shape. It works so-so. Sometimes we found it to be very effective, but we also been monitoring very consistently at the pressure chamber. And I would strongly encourage you, if you have a little bit extra money and you're trying to hide it from the tax man, buy one. It's just as good as an exercise bike. So if you use it, you'll love it. And if you don't, well, I'll say if you use it, you'll find it useful. You may not love it. But if you don't, it's just going to collect dust, and maybe then you shouldn't consider buying one. With that, any questions? And I thank you guys for your attention.
Hey, David.
Yes.
Doesn't the deficit irrigation model somewhat assume little variability in water quality? Because if you bring in the sodium issues that we have on the west side and other areas because of the well water, and if you guys start cutting back on irrigation during a critical development period for your trees, then you're going to create another effect that maybe a lot of people aren't going to be prepared to deal with.
Thank you for my oversight. I appreciate that. No, I mean, that's really a question. Question with sodium. And this is not just the west side. It also becomes a well issue, even on sandy soils. So on low cation exchange capacity soils, so sand, loamy sands, you may have a salt issue even though the water is looking pretty clean. Contrasting to the west side, where you're going to be putting on an EC of 2 to 2.5, I've seen on some of these wells because people are looking for water, and highly variable water coming out of the canal, just so if you guys are in that situation. So the short answer is, if you are pumping from a well, there's a good chance you're not going to be deficit irrigating, and keep that thing full throttle and cut it a little bit to help, maybe about 2 weeks prior to harvest. But I'm with you. If you cut that thing hard in June, you're going to suck all that salt into the root zone, and your trees are going to start showing uptake.
Well, and they won't recover come fall either. That's the one thing that I think folks don't realize either, is that little, what do you call it? It's changed from surface water to wells. And if you're practicing this deficit irrigation, and guys don't understand that you don't do the same deficit irrigation when you're pumping out of your wells, then you're gonna put that tree into a mode where it won't recover for 2 years. And
I'm with you. And probably to further that up is, if you are on a well or you're in those soils, we need to start these leaching programs earlier. Waiting till January, I'm sorry, you can't do it. And in many of these soils, we need to apply somewhere around a foot of water, 10 to 12 inches of water. And there's no way we can apply that in 3 weeks between Christmas and bud swell on the tree. So we need to start this thing back in late November, December if you're pumping from a well. Soils like this isn't going to require as much, but soils on the west side, you need at least 12 inches. We were able to drop some soil down in a trial that I'm working with a farmer. We took ECs of 4 and 5, average root zone salinities, dropped them to about 1.2 with 10 inches of water, and that was around the Los Banos area on that heavier soil. In contrast, we'd probably be able to do that with 8 inches of applied water or 7 inches of applied water on this. And you have to count that we had a couple inches of rain along with that. So we looked at maybe 12 to 15 inches of applied water to get that leaching. And the other thing is, if you're in a heavy salt problem and you're on double line drip, you need to be running those sprinklers during those first fall rainstorms. Because otherwise it keeps moving all that salt right back into the root zone, because the root zone is the driest area of the tree. So it'll keep pushing that salt back in. So keep that in mind. We'll rehash that as we get a little bit closer in the fall. But we need to make sure, if you're pumping from the well, put it into your notebook now. Start leaching right after Thanksgiving. And by the almond conference, you should be through your first cycle of your orchard.
Can you really accomplish the same kind of leaching with double line drip versus micro sprinklers? Because it does appear that you don't get the same effect if you're trying to leach with your double line drip systems, which again, I think the majority of these trees are kind of, on heavier soils are double lined, and I just, again, I think it's just not understood that these microsystems were never really, how do you say, designed for this kind of leaching that we need to do, because we haven't gotten rainfall or anything like that, David. So,
well, the system I worked in was double line drip. And my thought is yes, you can. And the Australians do it all the time. And I think it's just we don't know how long it takes to get the water out. You know, when we're looking at a week to essentially apply a ½ inch of water, or 3 days or 2 days of runtime, or a day of runtime to get out a ½ inch of water, we don't have enough time in our plan to get enough water out, and we don't know where we are in our profile fill.
that's a key.
And so you have to start off with a full profile before any leaching can even occur. And that's why it's important to start so early before the rain even comes in, because all their added rain will just help leach, and then you subtract water out. The problem is, I actually believe, is when you're paying $1,500 an acre foot for water and you're going to dump it on the ground to leach out salt, it hurts. I mean, I think that's a major hurdle and barrier right now. But I'm with you on it all. I think we need to keep salts in mind when we do this. Lacey?
Just a note on boron too. I know conventional wisdom says that sodium and EC, that the boron is not a problem unless you have that. I did Hi, Lacey Mount, Della Valley Laboratory. I did a project out on the west side for an irrigation district, and we were looking at 70 sets of water samples. 20 of those had high boron, in excess of 1 part per million boron, but they actually had fairly low ECs. So it's, don't just take an EC and say I'm low EC and think that you don't have to worry about leaching. So, yeah.
Couldn't say it better myself. All right, any other questions? I know it's going to be a tough year. Let's try to all stick together on this. I know it's really hard, and there's always a lot of finger pointing going on, but let's not start pointing them at each other, and let's see what we can do and make something out of this year. I know it's going to be a tough one on you guys, but thank you for your attention. I appreciate it.